Before I say anything else, I'd like to start by acknowledging that I am in College Park, and that here in Washington, D.C., where I live, are located on the ancestral territories of the Piscataway, Nacotchtank, and their indigenous kin and neighbors. As a member of the University of Maryland, a land-grant university, I want to acknowledge the 202,000 acres of stolen indigenous land taken and distributed to the university under the Morrill Act in 1862. And I want to acknowledge the separation that these and many other acts of colonialism, assimilation, and genocide, which included geological and paleontological and other museum collecting, generated between indigenous peoples and their homelands. And I honor the continued power and resilience of indigenous communities and nations. And I want to further acknowledge the University of Maryland's connections to slavery and to generations of racialized trauma rooted in the institution. As a member college of universities studying slavery, the University of Maryland has undertaken the 1856 project, which is located in the archives and special collections, which is committed to investigating and illuminating these histories. I'm very grateful to my many friends and colleagues who continue to work with us in PWI institutions like this one with patience as we undertake collaborative and decolonizing and reparative work in our collections and institutions. So thank you again for having me. As Andrea mentioned, I'm an assistant professor in archives and digital curation here at the University of Maryland, College Park, and the iSchool. My work largely focuses on how cultural heritage institutions share knowledge. And so for a long time, I've been interested in these institutions as kind of power brokers and gatekeepers of knowledge. Most recently, I've focused on how that happens for Native and Indigenous communities and the ways we can use information approaches to complicate or repair or subvert that dynamic. But before that, I was more focused on institutional cultures and the kind of inner workings of these spaces. So today, I'm going to begin by giving you a sneak peek of the argument in the book. Here's the book, which is out in paperback. Woohoo! I'm going to describe some of the original impetus and context for the book, talk about my methods and some of the historical but largely ethnographic research, including the setting and some of the complexities there, and then describe some of the key findings, including describing the various cultures of expertise that are involved in planning what became the David H. Koch Hall Fossils Deep Time. And I'm going to talk specifically about some of the debates that emerged in depicting deep time and climate change and kind of the role of humans among these different experts involved in planning the exhibition. And then I'm going to try to answer the question, who cares? That's important. So the overall claim of the book is that we're seeing this increasing tension in the research and outreach functions of the museum. Here, large kind of natural history museums, so think the Field, American Museum of Natural History, in this case, Smithsonian's NMNH, National Museum of Natural History. And I get there through a close investigation of exhibition processes, which are really this interesting kind of microcosm of the wider organization. And I show how that tension manifests in three main spheres in exhibit content. So what's in the public-facing galleries themselves, and sort of look at this shift in technology and also the tone of communication. In the teams that plan the exhibitions, so thinking about these increasingly departmentalized expert cultures that are working across each other in these spaces, and then institutional mission. So what do institutions say about themselves and what they're doing, and looking at, in the Smithsonian's case, at this idea of diffusion kind of really expanding in the contemporary period. And for today, I'm mostly going to focus on these first two. So to talk about that tension in the book, I use two main concepts. The first, borrow from Anna Singh, to talk about these creative, awkward, power-laden, unstable connections across difference. And then I use a more localized term, which emerged from Smithsonian documentation, to talk about the more aspirational way that different expertise and projects and interdisciplinary work builds kind of the strength of a place like the Smithsonian. And then I go on to argue that those creative tensions might be important for museums in trying to display some of the world's most important, but also most politicized topics here, climate change. And throughout, I try to show how fossil displays are both embedded in the politics of the contemporary moment and also mediated through different expert lenses and techniques and technologies for museum communications. So I began this project to investigate how changing institutional cultures and values impacted the communication of scientific knowledge for the public. At the time, as Andrea mentioned, I was in anthropology and I was a museum anthropologist. So I was interested in the anthropology of museums as cultural spaces. And I first got very interested in ethnography of big bureaucratic institutions and Laura Nader's idea of studying up or kind of studying these elite spaces of power. I was really interested in the kind of McDonaldization, Disneyfication, corporate sort of museums in the neoliberal environment, essentially like that. And sort of how, how these kinds of fears around spectacle and kind of pop culture and the quote unquote hyperreal were embedded in museums. It didn't really end up being a main focus of this project, as I'll talk about, but I was interested in that at the time. Social studies of science, so not how science is being produced in labs per se, but this alternative form of knowledge production that was happening kind of for the public, for public consumption. And then lastly, ethnographies of collaboration in teams and sort of looking at that. So original research questions, what was the relationship between institutional cultures and then how knowledge was presented to the public? What contexts and shifts had impacted exhibitions communication, thinking in a multimedia way, and then the kind of where, when, why. Essentially, I sent feeler emails out to like every major natural history museum in North America, and just kind of was trying to see who might be interested in an ethnographer with a notebook showing up at their door. I was very serendipitously, I think this happens a lot with research partnerships, right? I was able to work at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History through a series of essentially happenstances. So the associate director for public engagement thought that this ethnographic approach was interesting from a managerial perspective. And I think that's in part because corporate ethnography has actually gained a lot of interest in sort of business schools and in other spaces. She got me in touch with Scott Wing, who's a curator of paleobiology, paleobotany, who really, she got me in touch with him because he ran fellowships, but he happened to be in these early meetings about the museum's largest ever exhibit renovation, Deep Time. And he and others on the team thought it might be interesting to have the process documented. And the other super lucky thing was that Michael Mason, who was then director of exhibits, was an anthropologist by training. So he was open to this crazy idea. So the project, this is the bottom is the picture of the hall when I first started this project. And so in 2012, 2013, I spent a year doing fieldwork at the museum to give you a sense of how small a slice this piece of the planning is. So this is the hall on the left that we're talking about from a historical drawing of the exhibit space. It's still the same floor plan. And then here's my little research time in this mega 9-year project. And actually, as I'll talk about, the project even predated my arrival. And because I was interested in change through time, it's important to note that the hall had 3 iterations. So one when it was first put together at the turn of the century, one after a major redesign in the 60s, and then one in the 80s when the hall was as it was when I arrived at the museum. So methods, I did a lot of archival and oral history research, and almost half of the book that resulted focuses on these earlier histories of the halls. And the book is sort of organized so that you can read just a history, essentially, if you wanted to. And you could also just kind of read an ethnography. So the chapters sort of are interspersed. And of course, the bold can read the whole thing. So I spent all of the summer of 2012 at Smithsonian Institution archives, basically going every day and spending time looking through old curatorial reports and stuff like that. And then I, in total, conducted 56 recorded interviews at the institution, so 22 with the core current staff that was really part of the ethnography, and then 32 oral history interviews, plus another 16 kind of formative informal conversations with staff. Today, I'm mostly going to focus on findings from the interviews and the participant observation, and the time I spent kind of going to all these meetings and being in the exhibits office during the 10% phase, or the kind of conceptual phase of the exhibit. I'm not sure if there are graduate students in the room or not, but for anyone thinking about doing ethnography, I thought I'd spend a minute on the complexities of ethnography and institutional access. So ethnography obviously is wonderful, but it is super politically and socially and institutionally complicated. So one thing that we did kind of getting started to make people feel comfortable was to be really clear about when I was writing things that were on record and off record for the project. So I have here my project notebooks. So I was hired by the exhibits office to do audience research and other things for them. And so when I had the red notebook, it was like, we're in the clear. I'm not taking on record notes. We can say whatever. And then these are all my field notebooks with all my quote unquote scratch notes, jottings as the meetings were ongoing. And then there was also a lot of excitement after I did IRB approval at both Smithsonian and at UBC, where I was doing my PhD. And even after that, this excerpt here, what happened was there was a question about whether contractors could actually sign my consent forms as individuals, because while they're working for the Smithsonian, their creative ideas are sort of owned by the Smithsonian. And so that got elevated to the Office of General Counsel, which is the sort of lawyerly branch. And they created this unique content sharing agreement, which basically says that the ideas of the Smithsonian staff are owned by the Smithsonian content. And then the physical recordings and notebooks and other stuff are the Marsh content, and that we have like this free, irrevocable license to share it. When I actually went to publish the book, it turned out the lawyers there didn't care at all about this, but I did think it was like a very interesting methodological hiccup that I hadn't anticipated. So I thought I would share that in case anyone finds it interesting in terms of like doing ethnography in big bureaucracies. So here's the full team that I was working with. So the core development team met every other week for 2 full days. So I was at all those meetings, had researchers from 3 subdisciplines of paleobiology, which were responsible for the scientific messaging and the choice of the specimens for the exhibition, an education specialist who was supposed to kind of represent visitor perspectives, communication techniques, and learning objectives, an exhibit writer who was responsible for translating the science for the public in age-appropriate language, and the exhibit developer project manager who was dually tasked with coordinating the overall content and development of the hall, as well as the grittier scheduling and budgets and logistical aspects. And then there was also an internal exhibit design chief who was kind of coordinating the physical manifestation, and then some of the contracted firms. So the teams from the 2 private firms, Reich and Petch and Richard Lewis Media Group, the former actually kind of coordinated the meetings and their flow. And again, I had this role kind of as a audience researcher, a paid position to do that, so that I was at the table with a role on the team, and not just kind of the fly on the wall. So the Deep Time project, even before my arrival, already had its kind of main themes outlined: the history of life, Earth systems, and really importantly, lessons from Deep Time, to think about how this is important for understanding the present and future, and then how this will generate involvement with visitors. So even from its inception, there was this agreement that it wasn't going to just be another dinosaur hall, but it was going to be a hall to show contemporary society how to kind of learn from the long sweep of Earth history and how to act on that. David Koch's initial gift of $35 million formally launched the project. And now I'll just talk a little bit about the overall process that happened at that point once the funding was in place. So the team started from this content matrix, essentially highlighting the main time periods and stories that could be told in them. And then designers worked to translate that into, through these kind of meetings and discussions, into a conceptual bubble diagram outlining core topics and themes. And then that was iteratively, through extensive discussion, loosely mapped onto physical space. And here's another view of what that product looked like. So designers take that and then work with the team to shape the overall conceptual framework of the hall, distilled down into what's called a 10% package. Again, a lot of this is borrowed from architecture. So a series of documents, including a kind of vision, bubble diagram of ordered concepts, main messages, floor plan layout, and some renderings of the hall. And then the in-house writers also produce a final kind of concept narrative document, which outlines the main messages. So that's kind of what I was there documenting in my field work. And there's the kind of final floor plan and concept diagram and the rendering that came in the 10% phase. As you'll see, it does actually look quite a bit like this in the final. So back to the argument, what I'm going to do now is take you through some of the highlights of these levels or domains. So I'm going to start with group dynamics, because the nature of people and how they work together is core context for everything else. So I mentioned this hall had a long history as the primary place the museum conveys history of Earth. Historically, exhibits were curated by scientific curators, here really one curator and a couple of preparators who worked on the mounts. In the 1960s hall, there was still one main curator, but there were two professional exhibit designers that he was working with. And then in the 1980s, you had your first real teams. Those were very interdisciplinary, but you can see very male. Sue Voss is the writer, tellingly kind of background noise in the photo here. And in that 1980s process, you already see the tensions over expertise surfacing. So this is a memo from a curator to the exhibit team, basically saying, don't talk down to your colleagues just because they're there to communicate with the public. These comments such as dumb and botanical illiteracy, like don't make for a good team environment. So maybe don't talk to people like that. This is another great drawing from the 70s by an exhibit designer describing what exhibit meetings were like. So the finger of blame. So clearly there were already like a lot of tensions. Today, exhibits are put together by vastly interdisciplinary teams and huge numbers of offices. So with the growth of outreach focused departments and then kind of public communication and access, as well as a lot of the other kind of like bureaucratic functions, especially in a federally funded museum, there's just this huge growth of departments and staffs. So this is the diagram the exhibits office created to illustrate the number of players and departments involved in deep time. Here's it a little closer up, and here are curators and collections. So really a small piece of what's going on is the kind of scientific capital S piece, right? And for the most part, all of these different expertises and departments are siloed, and you can kind of feel that in the spaces themselves. So just to give you an example, when I was there, I had 3 offices. So my first office was in exhibits, which is a mix of offices and production labs. It's got a graphic lab, a shop for carpentry, model making, printing, other production work for temporary exhibits. It kind of feels like, you know, artists' laboratories, and then there's kind of project management cubicles in offices. In paleobiology, or paleo, it's kind of like a university department, right? It's covered with old books and papers and microscopes and card catalogs and staff that wear, you know, Star Wars t-shirts and the whole rest, right? And then the director's hallway. While I was writing the dissertation, I had an office in the director's hallway, and that's, you know, very carpeted and the kind of place where people wear pencil skirts and ties and court donors. And what I didn't really realize until later in my sort of fieldwork period was that on that first day, in that first meeting I went to, this room full of people were also meeting each other for the first time largely, and coming from many of these different kind of contexts and kind of institutional subcultures. So some things about how the meetings actually go. Technically, no one in the room has privileged speaking rights, and all ideas are theoretically equal at the table. But members of the group have different modes of communication. They're perceived to have different kinds of power, which may or may not relate to the training and background and discipline that they have and that they come from, and then the fact that some people have a certain role or purview kind of more in official capacity. So some things that you hear. The stereotype is that curators are more likely to assert their opinions without qualifying statements, to be super long-winded. They're super obsessed with facts in their own area of expertise. They don't want to cut text down. They're very keen to kind of tear apart the tone and word choice and English usage and grammar of exhibit text, even though they're not the writers on the project. And in exhibits, there's just a lot of running jokes about curators and how they comment on documents and how they sort of behave. And then there's sort of hypotheses that exhibits professionals and educators are, you know, more artistic and put more of themselves in their work. Maybe they're overly sensitive, that they're trained to accept everyone's perspectives. And that's kind of in contrast to scientists who consider that they know an objective truth out there and not everyone's opinions about that count. And so scientists are constantly worried that exhibit staff are going to dumb down their science and their work. So as a trained anthropologist, I was not really concerned with the truth of the stereotypes, but focused on how they revealed all these entrenched power dynamics at the museum, when it's known by everyone except curators that curators are of higher status and class than everyone else in the museum. Caveat to that is that exhibit does control the budget on an exhibit. So large scale exhibit projects and building renovations require external fundraising, and that comes through development. So for deep time, again, that gift, and then the sort of other 40 million they had to raise to get that off the ground was a big part of how kind of power is distributed. Public engagement experts coordinated the publicized delivery of the nation's T-Rex to the museum and associated public events, and that's sort of high profile stuff. And so development officers and in exhibits who actually controls the money, they do wield huge amounts of power, and exhibit managers and developers are charged with not only overseeing the budget, but the schedule for the exhibit planning process and the overall conceptual development of the exhibit. So that's actually like a lot that they're doing. But there's a strong sense that researchers and outreach staff among the two, that the other doesn't really understand what they do or how important it is. And there's a very strong sentiment that curators don't respect these other areas of expertise. And of course, each of these groups also has different educational training. So curators come on a kind of traditional academic trajectory, PhD, et cetera. The rest of the team have a little bit more alternative pathways, more communities of practice, applied expertise, as well as almost all of them have master's degrees in their fields. So among this mostly graduate educated English speaking set of museum professionals at one institution, you actually still have this politicized active translation that's happening across these different experts at the table. And that can be productive once you get through the kind of stereotypes and the sort of perception noise. And in fact, it was the director's impetus to take the whole team to North Dakota's Badlands to spend time together and sort of get to know each other as individuals and try to like respect that kind of expertise. So now I'm going to talk about exhibit content. Early exhibits, I'm going to gloss over a bit on this, but early exhibits were essentially organized by scientific classification, kind of taxonomic, systematic displays, largely the invertebrates and plants and like bone fragments of vertebrates and things, and then these sort of larger showy specimens, which were for the most part, once they were brought into the museum, they were prepared and then mounted. And when they were ready, they went up and they made room for them. And so there wasn't quite the same sense of like what the overall experience, like it wasn't really a thinking like that about what the experience was for a visitor. Once you get into the 60s, there was the beginnings of kind of this temporal ideas laid out in space, right? And actual pathways. So they built these kind of pathways for visitors to go through. And you had the first exhibit labels that actually tried to be more quote unquote inviting. So here's an example of a label before 1960, and here's the label after. So from this very kind of formal didactic tone to, would you like to touch a dinosaur bone? And you kind of see this across a lot of the labels and things like that. What I spend a bunch of time on that I thought would be fun to talk about here is the core debates that came up in the participant observation as these, because now we're kind of in this space where these trends have come to full fruition, right? And so these were the sort of main themes or sites of debate that emerged from exhibit meetings among the different experts. So in each case, I'll talk about the differences in perspectives and some of the among these experts in these kind of camps, and then how they kind of came to early consensus in part through the wonderful workings of designers and drawings and things like that. So the first debate I encountered was of what I've called real versus interpretation, or whether it was better to use singular displays of real things, fossil specimens, or to create highly artistic, contextual, or media-driven displays, with curators lending toward the former and educators and exhibit staff leaning toward the latter. So deep time was supposed to show interactions across ecosystems and climate conditions, even within time periods, such that merely showing a singular charismatic species is not really going to do it. And describing those kind of interrelations and connections is hard to do with something static, right? Like a fossil. So here's a drawing that the designer came up with to sort of try to describe and help the team to think through this dilemma. So you have on the left-hand side here, the beauty of the fossils mounted in empty space. And on the right-hand side, you have fully rendered artistic dioramas, and then a bunch of hybrid options in between. And in the final hall, which I did not write about in the book because the hall wasn't open yet, you can kind of see this in the final, how the team kind of grappled with this and essentially kind of did both. So in some cases, you have beautifully mounted specimens with, you know, of course, with some contextualization and you know, in text and imagery, right? There's a sort of part of a background there. But in other cases, you have these really gorgeous miniature dioramas with fully fleshed out environments. So the second debate was levels of resolution. So where along the spectrum from perfectly detailed and temporally literal to, which is the curatorial preference, to abstracted and narratively driven displays, outreach-oriented folks should be. So one solution was, again, this was by the media designer, Mark. The idea was to have these TPS, temporal positioning units, which would allow you to sort of have signage in the hall at various places that gave you that sense of exactly where in time are you, like what's happening with the climate here. This is an example of one of those signs in the final hall. So you can see it's got things about CO2 and average temperatures. And here it is. This is actually an image from the 3D virtual tour you can take. And you can see everything sort of around, and then you have these tall pillars that sort of signage with like what dates are you in and what's happening climatically. Third was reliability versus innovation. So there was a lot of concern for the tone and density of technology from simple and reliable, which is actually the preference of exhibit staff who have to deal with all the stuff that breaks, and then spectacular, innovative, right? So like, what are the really cool, wonderful multimedia things we can do, which in a hall that's open for 25 years with up to 8 million visitors a year is like not a great idea. So again, solutions pitched by media designers were to, this is the, so this was great. This thing at the bottom here is called App Shaker. And this was something where everybody agreed it was terrible. The scientists thought it didn't teach you anything, it wasn't really accurate. And the exhibits folks were like, it's gonna break. So everyone was cool with like scratching that. But the media designers sort of came up with this schematic to think about media density, right? So that in the final hall, you'd have really spaced out audiovisual elements with high concentrations in very select places. In particular, the Anthropocene section, where the team wanted to ask visitors to consider their own role in deep time and in climate change. And then you also have throughout the hall, so actually here's the Anthropocene section. I'll show you a couple different views of that in the final hall once it was open. And then the team also agreed on bronze statues, which are extremely durable participatory pieces. So bronze doesn't break. And then the last debate was authority participation. So at what level were museum scientists willing to give up authority or control over content in order to allow the public to kind of tinker or generate their own meanings or experiences or content, which is a real goal of education and exhibits folks, not a goal of curators. So the solution here was to have that kind of Anthropocene section, which the team started calling the bridge. Here's an early diagram on the whiteboard of it. And so the idea is that visitors could stand on this bridge, think about their own place in the history of Earth, look at the sweep of Earth's history, and have more of those participatory elements there in that particular space. And so here it is in the final hall. That's what originally was the bridge. So that, again, overlooks the gallery. The other solution to this sort of dilemma the team agreed on, and this was very meta for me as an ethnographer, to show the process of planning the hall to visitors. And actually a bunch of the photos that I was taking as an ethnographer ended up in the exhibit about the planning of the exhibit. Boom, that's crazy. So that was another thing that sort of allowed the team to think about how you could kind of invite people into the process while still sort of saying like, these are the scientific facts and this is what matters. And, you know, we are experts and we can tell you these things. So here's another example of things that were kind of part of the Last American Dinosaurs show that was up once the hall closed for 5 years. And again, here was the kind of final rendering at the end of the 10% phase. So I said I would talk about who cares. So, you know, this is the small piece of goings on at one museum, however much historically contextualized or placed within literature. So here's some of my take. Museums are perhaps the most trusted information institutions. The most recent study on this in 2021 showed that museums are second only to friends and family as trusted sources of information. And in the top 2 reasons why they are that, it's because they're considered quote unquote fact-based and hold original or authentic objects. And in that context, and in the quote unquote infodemic, you've got the world's experts on science communication, on education, on informal learning, in these different subfields of paleontology. And you give them the task of communicating the deep history of Earth and humans' impacts on climate, and ask them to argue until they find a compromise and until they agree on the best way to do that. And I think that maybe that's important for thinking about the sort of future of public discourse and how museums can kind of function and make an impact in that space. I love this quote from Kim Moeller, who's an exhibit designer. And she said in her interview, you've got the science side, it's got the information, and then we're on the diffusion side. Like, we're the people trying to get the word out. And that tension is what we want to have, because that's actually how it should be. And that's an important tension that gives us something important, and I wouldn't change it. So in this exhibit process, you can see how many of these creative compromises, again, what I call complementarities, between different expertises manifested in the final haul and in the display of fossils in their interpretive contexts in the world's most visited natural history museum on the National Mall. And this team of experts who kind of didn't agree created this pretty unusual dinosaur exhibit on that stage, which is actually not about dinosaurs, right? And it's actually about what the history of Earth can tell us about pressing environmental issues. So that's one way to think about it. But I also was a bit more of an optimist when I wrote this book pre-pandemic. So there are 2 other aspects of the work on Who Cares that I've been thinking about a lot more. One is that the power dynamics at play here between curators and other experts is something you see in lots of organizations among many teams. And if we're going to create more equitable and inclusive work environments, we have to be really aware of those power dynamics. And of course, this is true in universities as well. It's true in corporate environments. And we need to recognize others' expertise and just how many people it takes to accomplish something. So it's not just the professor or the curator or the scholar who maybe goes out and gets the PR, but like huge teams of people that make all these endeavors possible, and how important that is for valuing people's labor and acknowledging people's work. And I know folks in the room look at, collections management, or look at technologists working on VR or other stuff, right? And I think that's, we see this in the way archivists have historically been treated by scholars, right? And so thinking about what these dynamics look like in different contexts. Project management wise, understanding those perceptions and stereotypes, and then clearly delineating those roles and kind of heading them up ahead of time is important for us to work together and to sort of have an equitable process that everyone feels good about. And then lastly, I think the ethnographic piece of this is important for museums and other cultural heritage institutions as they sort of take a hard look at their own power dynamics more broadly. I have a bit about this in the book, and especially in the introduction, but it's not really the focus, and I kind of wish there was more here on it. But these power dynamics are highly gendered, highly racialized, and we kind of need to attend to that if we want these institutions to change. Even when you talk to curators in history or anthropology or these other fields, which are normally very attuned to power dynamics, you end up with people working in these spaces who seem in their actual institutional role completely oblivious to their own institutional power dynamics or positionality, or what the elite PhD means. And museums have to attend to that. You see a lot of new strategic plans and internal DEIA work happening, but I think often those initiatives are coming from staff in lesser positions of power, often from women and people of color, and so they're not really making that higher level change. And you also see a lot of staff across museums and all these different super departmentalized cultures just getting caught up in their own infighting over these kinds of things rather than seeing the big picture and what they're all working towards. So I hope that the potential that I saw here for kind of tackling these complex issues and bringing experts together and finding those complementary spaces can allow museums to fulfill their role in the current information scape, but doing so ethically and acknowledging the sort of diversity that we need to see in the field. Thank you very much.